Mira Voss had appraised 11,000 pieces of jewelry in her life, and she had never once seen a woman's hands shake the way this woman's hands were shaking. The ring sat on the black velvet pad between them, small and unremarkable to anyone who didn't know how to look. Rose gold worn thin at the band, a single pale sapphire set slightly off-center. Mira had already reached for her loop before she noticed the woman glancing at the shop's front door every few seconds, as if she were counting down to something. "You said you found this in your late aunt's things," Mira said, turning the ring under the lamp. "That's right." The woman's voice came out too fast. "I just need to know what it's worth. Today if you can." Mira had heard that urgency before, from people selling off wedding rings during a divorce, from people paying for a parent's funeral. This was different. This felt like someone running. "Take your time," Mira said gently, more out of habit than real reassurance, sliding the loop closer to the lamp. "A piece like this deserves a proper look before I put a number on it." The woman gave a short, humorless laugh. "I don't have a proper amount of time. That's rather the point." She turned the band toward the light and found the engraving on the inside. Tiny, nearly worn away, the kind of mark only a trained eye would catch. 3 letters. Date. And beneath them, half erased, the fragment of a family crest she recognized from a missing persons flyer that had hung in her mother's shop for over 20 years, yellowed and curling at the corners, because her mother had never had the heart to take it down. The year a 22-year-old kidnapping case had gone cold. Mira's stomach dropped. She kept her face still, the way her mother had trained her to when a piece was worth far more than a seller understood. "Where did you say your aunt got this?" The woman didn't answer. She was already looking past Mira, toward the window, toward a black car that had pulled up across the street and simply stopped there. Engine running, no one getting out. "I have to go," the woman said, snatching the ring back before Mira could photograph the engraving. "Forget I came in." "Wait." The bell over the door was already ringing behind her. Mira stood alone in the shop with her hands empty and her mind racing, replaying 3 letters and a broken crest she had seen only once before, on a flyer her mother kept behind the register out of some private, 22-year-old guilt she'd never fully explained. The Kestrel family had offered a reward once, a long time ago, for any information about a missing infant heir. Mira had been a child herself when the flyer went up. She had always assumed, like everyone else in the city, that the story had ended the way those stories usually did. Quietly, badly, without an answer. She looked at the black car still idling across the street. Whatever that ring was, someone out there wanted it badly enough to follow a frightened woman into a small appraisal shop on a Tuesday afternoon. And Mira had just gotten a good enough look at the engraving to know exactly whose name might be attached to it, if she was brave enough or foolish enough to find out for certain. She reached for her phone to photograph the security footage before anyone could ask her to delete it. Her hands were steadier than she expected. Years behind the counter had taught her that panic never helped a piece of evidence survive the next 24 hours, and some part of her, the part her mother had trained since childhood, was already cataloging details the way she'd catalog any unusual find. Timestamp, weight of the ring, the particular wear pattern on the band that suggested decades of use rather than a recent purchase. The black car didn't move for nearly a full minute. Long enough that Mira crossed to the window herself, half expecting someone to step out. No one did. Then, as if satisfied by whatever it had been waiting to see, the car pulled away from the curb and disappeared around the corner, leaving her alone with an empty velvet pad and a photograph on her phone that she suspected was about to change everything. She locked the front door early that day, something she hadn't done in 3 years of running the shop by herself, and sat down at her workbench with the photograph enlarged on her screen, staring at 3 letters and a broken crest until the shapes stopped looking like abstract scratches and started looking like a name. The shop had been her mother's, and before that, her grandfather's. A narrow storefront squeezed between a shuttered tailor and a coffee shop that changed owners every year, its window lined with a modest collection of estate pieces nobody in the city's wealthier circles would bother to notice. Voss Appraisals, the sign read, gold letters chipped at the edges. Mira had grown up learning gemstones the way other children learn multiplication tables. Matched inclusions to birthstones, hallmark alphabets to decades, clasp mechanisms to the exact factories that produced them 100 years ago. Her mother used to say a piece of jewelry never lied, even when the person selling it did. People inherited stories along with their rings and brooches, and half of Mira's job was untangling the true story from the one a seller wanted to believe. It was a small, exacting skill, and for most of her life it had felt like enough. Didn't feel like enough anymore. The foreclosure notice was folded into thirds in the drawer under the register, where Mira put things she couldn't look at twice in one day. Her mother had taken out a loan against the shop 2 years before she died, to cover treatment the insurance wouldn't touch, and Mira had been paying it down in small, losing increments ever since. 3 weeks. That was what the letter said. 3 weeks before the bank, or more precisely, before a holding company that had quietly bought the debt from the bank 6 months earlier, took the keys. She hadn't looked closely enough at the holding company's name to notice the law firm listed as its registered agent. Not yet. Across the city, in a part of town Mira had never had reason to visit, Damon Kestrel sat in an office with the blinds drawn at 3 in the afternoon, listening to a report about a woman who had walked out of a small appraisal shop without leaving her name. "She had the ring," said the man delivering the report. Young, nervous, knew enough to still be careful with Damon. "We lost her 2 blocks east. But the appraiser got a photograph of the engraving before she left." Damon didn't look up from the ledger in front of him. 22 years of ledgers, invoices, shipping manifests. The visible skeleton of a family business that had survived by trusting almost no one who wasn't born into it. His father had taught him that lesson in blood, quite literally. The year his baby nephew vanished from a hospital nursery and the family's own trusted people came back with nothing. Outsiders had failed them once, catastrophically, and Damon had spent every year since making sure it never happened again by simply refusing to let outsiders close enough to fail. It was a policy that had cost him nothing he could see. It had also meant that for 22 years, the one person closest to the family's finances, the one man who had personally overseen the search, who had personally delivered the news that the trail had gone cold, had never once been questioned, because he wasn't an outsider. He was Vincent Kestrel, cousin by marriage, the family's counsel, the man everyone trusted precisely because Damon trusted almost no one else. "Find the appraiser," Damon said. Quietly. "I want to know what she saw before anyone else does." Vincent, standing near the window with a coffee he hadn't touched, said nothing at all. He had already made a call of his own 20 minutes earlier, to a holding company he controlled through 3 layers of paperwork, instructing them to accelerate the foreclosure on a small shop called Voss Appraisals before its owner had time to understand what she'd photographed. He smiled at Damon on his way out. "Let me know if there's anything the firm can help with." Damon nodded, the way he always did, because Vincent was family, and family was the only thing in this world Damon Kestrel had ever fully believed. Later that evening, alone in his office, Damon opened the same file he'd opened 100 times before, a slim folder containing everything the family had ever gathered on his nephew's disappearance. Hospital admittance form. A fire marshal's report, inconclusive on the cause. A single photograph of his sister-in-law, Eleanor, holding an infant who would have been 22 years old now if he'd lived. Damon had read that folder so many times the paper had gone soft at the corners, the way Mira's mother's missing persons flyer had gone soft from 20 years behind a register 2 neighborhoods away, though neither of them knew it yet. He didn't believe the appraiser. He told himself that firmly, closing the folder, turning off the desk lamp. He had learned, at considerable cost, not to believe strangers who claimed to know something about his family's oldest wound. But he didn't destroy the photograph she'd sent either. He left it open on his phone, face down on the desk, until well past midnight. Across the city, Mira closed out the shop's books for the day and found herself doing something she hadn't done in months, pulling the old missing persons flyer out from behind the register and looking at it properly for the first time since childhood. Her mother had never explained why she kept it there, only that some debts didn't have a statute of limitations, and that a person ought to remember what they could, even when remembering didn't change anything. Mira had always assumed her mother meant something small and personal. Standing there now, holding a photograph of an engraving that matched the crest on that same flyer, she wondered if it had never been small at all. Took Mira 4 days to be certain. She started with the crest, cross-referencing it against a database of family marks she'd built over a decade of estate work, and found the match within an hour. The Kestrel family, a name whispered more often in the back rooms of the city's courthouses than in polite conversation. She found the missing persons case next, buried in an archived news database. An infant 22 years ago, taken from a hospital nursery during a fire alarm that investigators later determined had been deliberately set. No ransom demand. No body. No answer ever, only a case that went cold and a family that stopped talking to the press. The engraving inside the ring, EK, and a date, matched the initials of the infant's mother, listed once in an old society column as Eleanor Kestrel, dead 3 years after her son disappeared, the coroner's report citing a heart that had simply, quietly given out. Mira sat with that for a long time. She could have called the police. She almost did, twice, her thumb hovering over the number before she set the phone down each time. A 22-year-old cold case with no fresh leads beyond a photograph of an engraving would sit in a queue for months, maybe years, handled by whoever drew the short straw that week. And whoever had been in that black car outside her shop clearly had resources the police didn't. Resources fast enough to already be circling. There was a second name on the missing persons file, listed as the family's point of contact for the investigation, and it took Mira less than 10 minutes to find that Damon Kestrel now ran the family's affairs directly. Going to him was not a safe choice. Mira understood that clearly enough. Understood that the Kestrel name carried weight in rooms where the law was more of a suggestion than a rule. Understood that walking into that kind of power with nothing but a photograph and a hunch might be the last unremarkable thing she ever did. But the alternative was worse. If she sat on what she knew, and the woman who'd fled her shop turned up dead, or the child that ring belonged to remained lost for another 22 years because Mira had been too afraid to make a phone call, she wasn't sure she'd be able to live with that kind of quiet. Her mother had kept that flyer behind the register for 2 decades. Mira had never asked why. She wondered now if her mother had known something small and unprovable, the kind of thing you carry without ever being able to act on it, and had simply run out of time before she found the courage. Mira wasn't going to run out of time in the same way. She photographed everything. The ring's engraving, her notes, the security footage from the shop, time-stamped and backed up in 3 places, before she picked up the phone and called the only number she could find for Kestrel Holdings, asking, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, to speak with Damon Kestrel about a ring engraved with his sister-in-law's initials. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that Mira thought the call had dropped. "Where are you?" the voice finally said. Not a question. An instruction. Mira gave the address of her shop, and then, because some instinct told her it mattered, she added one more sentence before he could hang up. "I think whoever your family has been looking for might still be alive. And I think someone close to you already knows that." The line went dead. Mira set the phone down on the counter, next to the foreclosure letter she still hadn't fully absorbed, and understood, with a kind of calm clarity, that there was no version of her life after this phone call that looked like the one before it. She spent the next 40 minutes doing the only thing that made the waiting bearable, organizing her evidence the way she'd organize a contested estate, everything labeled, everything time-stamped, everything backed up somewhere. Vincent Kestrel's law firm, whichever holding company he controlled, could never quietly make disappear. She printed a copy of the engraving photograph and mailed it, on impulse, to her own post office box under a different name, a small paranoid insurance policy she hoped she'd never need. Her phone buzzed once more before Damon arrived. A text from the bank's loan servicer, informing her that her foreclosure timeline had been flagged for expedited review. She hadn't requested any review. She read the message twice, feeling the coincidence settle into something heavier than coincidence, and understood that whoever was watching the ring was already watching her too. Damon Kestrel did not believe her. He arrived at the shop 40 minutes later, alone except for one driver who waited outside, and he studied the photograph Mira showed him with the flat, unreadable expression of a man who had been lied to about this exact subject more times than he cared to count. Jakix, con artist. A man 3 years ago who had produced a forged birth certificate and vanished with a down payment before anyone thought to check it. "People have been telling my family what we want to hear for 2 decades, Damon said. "It's a very lucrative story if you're willing to lie." "I'm not asking you for money," Mira said. I'm telling you what I found because I don't know what else to do with it. He looked at her the way he looked at everything that wasn't blood. Carefully, from a distance, unwilling to close it. Then give it to the police. I tried. It'll sit for months. Someone in that car outside my shop didn't look like they were willing to wait months. That at least made him pause. He left without agreeing to anything, and for 2 days Mira heard nothing. On the 3rd day, the bank called about her foreclosure. Not with a delay, which she'd hoped for after finally scraping together a partial payment, but with a demand for the full balance within a week, an acceleration clause she hadn't known existed, buried in fine print her mother had signed under duress 2 years earlier. Mira called the loan servicer twice, and both times the person on the phone cited instructions from the holding company that now owned the debt, a company whose paperwork, when Mira finally dug through the public filings herself, led back through 2 shell entities to a law firm she recognized from a business card Damon Kestrel had left on her counter without meaning to. Kestrel, Voss and Pratt. Attorney Vincent Kestrel, senior counsel. Not her family. The coincidence of a shared name in a different firm entirely, she told herself, until she looked closer and realized it wasn't a coincidence at all. Vincent's firm had absorbed a smaller practice 8 years ago, one that had, decades earlier, briefly represented her grandfather in a business dispute. It was a thread so old and thin it shouldn't have mattered, except that it meant Vincent Kestrel had known the Voss name, and the shop, long before Mira ever called Damon. She sat with that discovery for a long time, feeling the ground under her shift. Mira thought about calling Damon immediately, then decided against it. She needed to be certain before she handed him a suspicion this serious about a man he'd trusted his entire adult life. She spent the afternoon instead pulling every public filing connected to Kestrel, Voss and Pratt she could find, cross-referencing incorporation dates against the timeline of her mother's original, unrelated legal trouble decades earlier, until the shape of it became impossible to ignore. Vincent's firm had grown methodically, precisely in the years following the kidnapping, absorbing smaller practices, consolidating control over exactly the kind of quiet financial infrastructure a man might need if he intended to move money without anyone noticing for a very long time. It wasn't proof of anything criminal on its own. Lawyers built firms. Firms absorbed smaller ones constantly. But paired with everything else, it stopped feeling like a coincidence and started feeling like a pattern only visible once you knew to look for it. Much like a hallmark stamped too lightly to notice, until someone showed you exactly where to angle the light. Damon called that evening. His voice different than before. Quieter, harder to place. I had someone locate the woman who fled your shop, he said. Her name is Rosa Doyle. She worked as a private nurse for my sister-in-law before she died. I want you there when I talk to her. Rosa Doyle sat in the back room of a diner 2 neighborhoods away. Hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking, watching Damon with the same wariness Mira remembered from their first meeting. I didn't steal it, Rosa said immediately. Eleanor gave it to me before she died. She made me promise I'd keep it safe, that someday it would matter, and I never understood what she meant until I saw a man watching my building last month. Watching you, Damon repeated. He's been coming around for weeks. I got scared and tried to sell the ring somewhere quiet, somewhere I didn't think anyone would trace it. Rosa's hands tightened around the cup. There's something else. Eleanor told me once, near the end, that she didn't believe her son had died the night of the fire. She said someone in the family knew more than they were telling her, someone she trusted completely, right up until she stopped trusting anyone at all. Damon leaned forward slightly, the practiced stillness he usually wore slipping for just a moment. Tell me exactly what she said. Word for word, if you can remember it. Rosa wrapped both hands tighter around her cup, as if the memory itself needed steadying. She used to say it in the quietest voice, like she was afraid the walls were listening. They tell me he's gone, Rosa, but a mother knows. I thought it was grief talking for the longest time. Grief does strange things to people, makes them see hope where there isn't any. But she said the same thing word for word 3 years running, right up until the night she died. Grief doesn't usually stay that specific for that long. Damon went very still. She never told you who, he said. No. But she stopped speaking to your family's lawyer entirely in her last year. Wouldn't let him in the house. I always thought it was grief talking. I'm not so sure anymore. Mira watched something shift behind Damon's eyes. Not disbelief this time, but the beginning of a question he didn't want to ask, about a man who had been standing at his side, unquestioned, for the entirety of the 2 decades since his nephew disappeared. Rosa excused herself not long after, saying she needed air, and Mira followed her out onto the sidewalk, leaving Damon alone at the table with a coffee he wasn't drinking either. Rosa turned to her before getting into a cab. "You should be careful," Rosa said. "I liked Eleanor. I loved that woman, actually, more than I've loved most people in my life. But the family she married into eats its own when it's frightened enough. Don't mistake his kindness tonight for softness. Men like that don't stay soft for long once they decide someone's betrayed them." "I'm not doing this for his kindness," Mira said. "No," Rosa agreed, studying her for a moment. "I don't think you are. That's probably the only reason I trust you at all." Mira walked back into the diner alone, and found Damon exactly where she'd left him, staring at nothing, turning a decision over that she suspected he'd been avoiding for 22 years. The independent verification Mira had been chasing came from an unlikely place. A hospital records clerk, retired now, who Mira tracked down through the maternity ward staffing logs from the night of the fire. The woman remembered the alarm clearly, remembered the chaos of evacuating newborns, and remembered something that had never made it into any official report. A second infant, briefly unaccounted for during the same evacuation, quietly returned to a different family within the hour, no questions asked, paperwork corrected before morning shift. "There were 2 Kestrel boys born that same week," the clerk told Mira, her voice thin with a particular guilt of someone who had noticed a wrongness decades ago and said nothing. "Cousins, not brothers, but close in age. I always wondered if the wrong file got pulled during the panic." Nobody wanted to hear it. Mira brought this to Damon expecting resistance. Instead, she watched him go somewhere distant and cold, doing arithmetic she could see hurt him. "Vincent's son," Damon said slowly. "He was born the same week. He'd be the same age now. You think they were switched?" "I think," Damon said and stopped, because the next sentence required him to accuse the one man he had never once questioned. "I think someone with hospital access and a reason to erase an heir might have found it very convenient that 2 infants were briefly indistinguishable during a fire he could have set himself. It wasn't proof. It was a theory built on a retired clerk's memory and a coincidence of birth dates. But it reframed everything Mira had found so far. Not a kidnapping with no motive, but a kidnapping with the oldest motive there was. If the real heir had simply vanished, presumed dead, the entire Kestrel fortune would eventually pass through the family's remaining line. And Vincent, as its trusted counsel and closest surviving relation by marriage, stood to control nearly all of it, quietly for decades, without ever needing to inherit anything himself. Damon sat with his hands flat on the table for a long moment before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had lost its usual authority. "I let him run this family's finances for 22 years because he was blood adjacent and everyone else was a stranger to me. I never once asked to see the accounts myself. I told myself that was loyalty." He looked at Mira, and something in his face admitted a cost he clearly wasn't used to naming out loud. "It wasn't loyalty. It was fear of trusting the wrong person again, so I never trusted anyone new at all. I let the one man closest to the truth become the one man I'd never think to question." Mira didn't offer him comfort he hadn't asked for. "That's not something I can fix for you," she said instead. "But it is something you can stop doing right now, starting with actually looking at those accounts." He didn't like being told that. She could see it land somewhere stubborn in him. But he didn't argue either. The setback came 2 days later, when the hospital's original maternity records, the ones that might have shown a discrepancy in the transfer paperwork, turned up missing from the archive, checked out under a signature the records office couldn't produce. Someone had moved faster than they had. "He knows we're close," Damon said. "Or he's always known we'd get here eventually," Mira said. "He's had 22 years to prepare for this exact conversation." The plan that formed between them that night was reckless enough that Mira understood, clearly, that it might not work. They would need to find Vincent's son, the boy who might not be his son at all, and get a blood sample without alerting Vincent that anyone suspected the truth, before the succession hearing Damon's family had scheduled for the following month, the one where the missing heir's line would be formally declared extinct and Vincent, as senior counsel and closest remaining relation, would be granted full discretionary control of the estate. 22 days. That was what they had left. There was a harder conversation buried inside that plan, one Damon raised almost reluctantly on the drive back from the diner. If Vincent finds out we're circling his son, and he's as far along in covering his tracks as the missing hospital records suggest, he might not wait for the hearing to act. He might make Elliot disappear the same way he made my nephew disappear. Then we don't give him a reason to think we suspect anything until we absolutely have to, Mira said. We move carefully and we move fast. Both, not one or the other. That's easier to say than to do. I know. I do it with fragile antique settings for a living. You'd be amazed how often the two instructions have to happen at exactly the same time. He almost smiled at that, the first real crack of humor she'd seen from him since the ring first crossed her counter, and Mira found herself grateful for it, small as it was, in the middle of everything else that felt so precarious. Mira didn't sleep well that night, turning the theory over the way she turned over a suspect's stone under her loupe, looking for the flaw that would tell her it was glass pretending to be something finer. Held. Every piece she tested against it. The missing records, the accelerated foreclosure, Eleanor's quiet refusal to trust the family's lawyer in her final year, pointed the same direction, and none of it pointed anywhere else. She thought, too, about what it would mean for a young man somewhere in the city to wake up one morning still believing he was Vincent Kestrel's son, and go to sleep that night knowing he wasn't. She'd spent her whole career handling other people's inherited stories with care, because a ring or a locket could carry more weight than its owner ever admitted out loud. This was the same work, scaled up to something she wasn't sure she was equipped to carry. She decided, lying awake, that whatever happened next, she would not let this become another story handled carelessly. Vincent's son, the man everyone had always called Elliot Kestrel Pratt, worked, of all places, as an inventory clerk in one of the family's own warehouses, a job so far beneath the Kestrel name that Mira understood immediately why no one had ever looked closely at him. Hiding a missing heir in plain sight, doing menial work under a name half his own, was either an act of extraordinary cruelty or extraordinary caution, and Mira suspected, from the exhausted, careful way Elliot moved through the world, that it had felt like both to him for a very long time. Getting close to him without alarming Vincent took patience Mira didn't fully have and Damon didn't fully trust himself to have either. We do this carefully, Mira told him. The third time Damon suggested simply having Elliot brought in for questioning. If Vincent finds out we're looking at his son before we have proof, he'll bury it deeper than we can dig. Or he'll disappear entirely. You're telling me to be patient with the man who might have destroyed my family. I'm telling you that if you're wrong about how to handle this, an innocent young man loses the only life he's ever known, over a mistake he had nothing to do with. Elliot doesn't know what he might be. We don't get to make that decision for him with force. It was the first time Mira had drawn a line with him so plainly, and she watched Damon absorb it the way a man absorbs an old, familiar habit being named out loud for the first time. He wanted to move fast, to use the resources and pressure his name carried, the way his family always had. Mira wouldn't let him. To his credit, he didn't push past her. They arranged instead for Elliot to be invited to a routine company health screening, a benefit genuinely offered to all warehouse staff, unremarkable enough that no one would think twice, and a blood sample was drawn along with dozens of others that week. Damon paid for an independent lab, outside any account Vincent could access, to run the comparison against a sample of Eleanor Kestrel's DNA preserved from an old medical file Rosa Doyle still had copies of. While they waited 3 days for results, Mira noticed something she hadn't expected, an ease growing between her and Damon that had nothing to do with danger. He asked once about her mother's shop and listened, really listened, while she explained Hallmark systems and the particular quiet satisfaction of dating a piece of jewelry down to the decade it was made. He brought coffee to the shop one afternoon, unannounced, and sat in the back room reading old appraisal ledgers while she worked, saying almost nothing, simply present in a way that didn't ask anything of her. "You don't have to do that," Mira told him once. "I know," he said. "I want to." It was a small thing, ordinary in a way nothing else in the past 3 weeks had been, and Mira found she didn't mind it. There was one disagreement in those waiting days that neither of them fully resolved, though it changed something between them anyway. Damon wanted to have Elliot's apartment quietly searched while the blood results were pending, certain the extra confirmation would save them time if Vincent moved first. Mira refused outright. "He's not a suspect," she said. "He's a person who doesn't know yet that his whole life might be built on someone else's lie. You don't get to search his home because it's convenient for us. Convenient isn't the word I'd use for any of this. Then find a better one before you send anyone through his door." Damon didn't send anyone. He told her later, almost reluctantly, that it was the first time in years someone had told him no and he'd actually changed course because of it, rather than simply working around them. Mira didn't make more of it than it was. But she noticed it, the way she noticed a hallmark she hadn't seen before. Small, easy to miss, and telling once you knew to look. The lab results came back on the 20th day. The birthmark Rosa remembered from the infant Eleanor had described, a small mark shaped faintly like a crescent, behind the left ear, matched a mark Elliot had carried his entire life and never questioned. The blood type matched. The DNA, compared against Eleanor's preserved sample, came back with a probability high enough to leave no honest room for doubt. Elliot Kestrel Pratt was Eleanor Kestrel's son. The missing heir. Alive and entirely unaware, 2 miles from the warehouse floor where he'd spent the last 6 years of his life. The succession hearing was 2 days away. The hearing was held in a private conference room on the top floor of the firm's offices, a room with a long table and a view of the city that Vincent Kestrel had clearly chosen because it made him look untouchable. Family elders sat along one side. Vincent sat at the head, papers arranged in front of him with the calm precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment for 2 decades. "We are here," Vincent began, "to formally close a chapter this family has carried too long. 22 years is long enough to hope. It is time, out of love and respect for Eleanor's memory, to let her son rest." Damon sat beside Mira, silent, giving her the floor the way they'd agreed the night before. This part had to be hers. It was her evidence, her work, her words standing between Vincent and everything he wanted. "Before this family closes anything," Mira said, standing, "I'd like to show you what a ring can tell you if you know how to read it." She laid out the photographs first. The engraving, the crest, the hospital clerk's signed statement about the 2 infants briefly indistinguishable during the fire. Vincent's expression didn't change. He had built a career on not reacting. "A coincidence," he said smoothly when she finished. "An old woman's fading memory of a chaotic night, 22 years past. Sentimental, but hardly evidence." "It isn't the only evidence." Mira placed the lab report on the table. "This is a DNA comparison between a sample preserved from Eleanor Kestrel's medical file and a sample drawn 3 days ago from a warehouse employee named Elliot Kestrel Pratt." For the first time, something flickered behind Vincent's composure. "That's my son," he said. "The results say otherwise." Mira met his eyes without flinching. "He's Eleanor's son. Which means 22 years ago, someone with hospital access and a very clear motive made sure the real heir disappeared quietly enough that no one would ever think to look for him working in your own warehouse." The room had gone entirely silent. One of the elders leaned forward, reading the report herself, an older woman Mira recognized from the family photographs as Damon's aunt. Her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she checked the lab's letterhead against something on her own phone, verifying the lab's accreditation before she'd let herself believe a word of it. "This lab is legitimate," the aunt said finally, looking up. "I know their director personally. This isn't fabricated." Vincent's composure held for exactly as long as it took him to recalculate his footing. "Legitimate doesn't mean relevant," he said. "A DNA match proves biology. It doesn't prove I orchestrated anything. Children get switched in hospital chaos every year. Tragic, certainly. Criminal, not necessarily." "No," Mira agreed. A switched bracelet during a chaotic evacuation might not be criminal on its own. But missing transfer records checked out under a signature no one in that archive can produce. The same week we located the clerk who remembered the discrepancy. That's not chaos. That's someone cleaning up after themselves in real time. Vincent recovered quickly. Mira had to give him that. Even if that report is accurate, it proves nothing about intent. Records get confused in hospitals. Perhaps I unknowingly raised another family's child out of love. And now you'd punish me for a mistake I never made. It was a clever defense, calm and almost sympathetic, and Mira saw two of the elders hesitate, wanting badly to believe it. Then explain, Damon said quietly, speaking for the first time, why the original hospital transfer records went missing from the archive the same week we located the retired clerk who remembered the discrepancy. Explain why Voss Appraisals had its debt accelerated by a holding company traced back to your firm. The same week Mira Voss called me about that ring. A mistake doesn't cover its own tracks 22 years later. One of the younger elders, a cousin Mira hadn't been introduced to, spoke up before Vincent could recover his footing. The clerk's statement. Is she willing to testify to it formally, under oath? She already has, Mira said, sliding a signed affidavit across the table. Notarized 2 days ago. She's prepared to repeat every word of it to any court that asks. Vincent's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in 2 decades of careful composure. You'd take the word of a shop owner with a failing business over mine. I'd take proof over comfort, Damon said. Something I should have done 22 years ago instead of trusting you simply because you were the one voice I never thought to question. The door opened before Vincent could answer. Elliot stood in the doorway, still in his warehouse jacket, having been asked only that morning to come to a meeting he didn't fully understand, told the truth by Mira herself an hour earlier in language as gentle and honest as she knew how to make it. I don't know most of what's in that report, Elliot said, his voice unsteady but clear. I don't know what it means to be a Kestrel or an heir, or anything else you've all spent 20 years arguing about. But I know I've spent my whole life being told I was someone's disappointment, someone's mistake, by a man who apparently knew exactly why. I'd like to hear him explain that to my face, instead of to a room of people deciding my future without me in it. Vincent looked at the young man he had raised, and could not, Mira watched him realize in real time, actually deny. The confession that followed wasn't a speech. It was smaller than that, and worse. Vincent naming, flatly, without theater, the fire he'd arranged, the transfer he'd falsified, the 2 decades of quiet embezzlement he'd protected by making sure the true heir never knew enough about himself to ask questions. He said it because the alternative, in a room full of people who now had the proof to force the truth out of him regardless, was worse. The consequences that followed were not the ones violence would have delivered, and Damon, true to what he'd promised Mira, didn't reach for that option even when the elders offered it. Vincent was removed from the firm within the week. His access to every account frozen pending a full forensic audit. His license referred for disbarment, restitution ordered against everything he'd taken. He would answer to a court, not to the family's own private justice, because Mira had made that boundary a condition of her help from the very beginning, and Damon had chosen, at real cost to his own instincts, to honor it. 3 months later, Mira stood behind the counter of Voss Appraisals, the foreclosure notice finally, permanently gone from the drawer beneath the register. Not erased by a gift from the Kestrel family, which she'd refused outright, but resolved through a court-ordered restitution fund that repaid every account Vincent's holding companies had improperly seized, hers included, along with dozens of others across the city she'd never known existed. The missing persons flyer still hung behind the register. Mira had finally taken it down, framed it instead, and hung it near the door where anyone walking in could see it, not as a reminder of loss anymore, but of the one-time patience and a careful I had actually mattered. Elliot came by the shop sometimes in the early weeks, still learning how to hold the weight of a name he hadn't asked for. He wasn't rushing to claim a fortune or a title. He'd asked instead for time and space to decide what any of it meant to him, and Damon, to his credit and Myra's quiet relief, had given him exactly that, no conditions attached, no timeline enforced. The family's holdings were restructured under independent oversight, an outside auditor retained permanently, a rule written into the family's own governance that no single voice, however trusted, would ever again control the accounts unquestioned. It was the kind of change that helped no one dramatically and everyone quietly, the kind that mattered because it would still be there long after this particular scandal was forgotten. Damon still came by the shop too, though less carefully than he used to. He'd learned, slowly, to ask questions instead of assuming answers. About Hallmark systems, about her mother, about what Mira wanted for her own life beyond the counter she'd nearly lost. He never once suggested she needed rescuing. He respected, without being reminded twice, that the choice of whether anything between them became more than careful friendship belonged entirely to her. "I could have lost everything twice this year," Mira told him one evening, closing up the shop as the streetlights came on outside. "The business. And whatever this is." "You didn't lose either," Damon said. "No. But I noticed you never once tried to fix it for me. You let me handle it my way, even when your way would have been faster." "I'm still learning what trust looks like when it isn't blood," he admitted. "You were patient with that, more than I deserved." She didn't answer with a declaration. She answered by making him coffee the way she made it for herself, no cream, and letting him sit in the back room with her ledgers again, unhurried, the way they'd started. Rosa Doyle came by the shop the following week, unannounced, and asked Mira to appraise a small collection of Eleanor's remaining jewelry. Pieces Rosa had kept safe for over 2 decades, waiting, she admitted now, for a reason to finally let them go. Among them was a second ring, plainer than the first, engraved with a date that turned out to be Elliot's actual birthday rather than the one Vincent had recorded on his paperwork. "She wanted him to have these eventually," Rosa said. "I didn't know how to make that happen for 22 years. I'm glad I finally do." Mira appraised the collection for exactly what it was worth, refused any commission on the sale, and arranged for Rosa to deliver the pieces to Elliot herself, in person, without anyone else in the room. Some inheritances, she'd come to believe, needed to be handed over quietly, by the people who'd actually carried them, rather than announced by anyone else on their behalf. Elliot came into the shop himself not long after, still a little uncertain of how to carry a name that wasn't fully settled on him yet. He asked Mira, hesitantly, whether she thought a person could choose which parts of an inheritance to keep and which to set down. "I think that's the only honest way to do it," Mira told him. "The rest is just other people deciding for you, and you've had enough of that already." He nodded, turned the ring Rosa had given him over once in his hand, and left without saying much else. Mira watched him go and thought, not for the first time, that some of the most important appraisals she'd ever done had nothing to do with what a piece of jewelry was worth in dollars at all. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like anything at first. A woman noticing an engraving worn thin on a stranger's ring and choosing to ask one more question instead of letting the stranger walk out the door. It rarely feels heroic in the moment. It usually just feels like doing the next honest thing and hoping it's enough. Mira never found out what would have happened if she'd let that woman walk out of her shop that Tuesday afternoon without asking where the ring came from. She didn't need to. She knew only that the truth, once someone finally went looking for it, had a way of finding everyone it was owed to. The missing heir, the mother who never stopped believing he was alive, and the family who had spent 22 years mistaking silence for loyalty. Would you have made the same call Mira did? Walking evidence like that straight to the most dangerous family in the city instead of the police, knowing it might make you a target either way? And was Damon right to give Elliot time to decide who he wanted to be, instead of simply handing him a name and a fortune the moment the truth came out? If this story moved you, tell me your answer in the comments below, and consider subscribing for more stories like it. She never did find out who called that black car off, the day the ring first crossed her counter. Some questions, she decided, were allowed to stay unanswered, as long as the ones that mattered most had finally been settled.